Tilea's Troubles, Part 21. We Shall Stand. A Battle Report. The Bridge at Pontremola, 2401. They were to make their stand upon the northern side of the river at Pontremola. The ancient bridge had seen better days, but the damage was superficial, and it proved sufficiently strong to transport the Viadazan army. The two toll towers were abandoned, the keepers having fled in fear 3 months before, along with the Albanians crossing southwards to escape the vampire duke's deadly dominion. To the north, haphazardly delineated with hedgerows, the road was more than a byway of hardened earth, as ancient stone foundations lay beneath its packed dirt surface. Here it commenced its course northwards, through the gently sloping eastern hills of Ossola. For 6 full hours the Viadazan crusaders had stood in battle array, awaiting the foe. Not one man succumbed to weariness, for every one was sufficiently nervous concerning the imminent battle to ensure a churning stomach and a wakeful, keen urge to watch for the first glimpse of the enemy. Not a one of them had thought to sit and rest easy, despite no order given to the contrary. The mercenary crossbowmen, being professional soldiers, made a show of looking nonchalant, yet everyone could see that it was exactly that, a mere show, effortful and deliberate, an attempt to hide their true state of mind. The Carroccio stood behind the main battle line, its huge silken standard snapping in the breeze. Since the army had left Viadazan, every militiaman and citizen had assembled morning and night to pray around it, as if it were a famous shrine upon a holy day. It bore the most revered artefacts possessed by the Church of Moor in Viadazan, including the bones of no less than 3 saints, and the hilt of the sword an ancient hero had used to slay the first vampire ever to set foot in Tilea, or perhaps the second, or the third. It depended who exactly you asked, for neither living scholars nor ancient books agreed. The Crusaders' right flank consisted of 2 regiments of horse, one heavy, the other light. The former, positioned forwards, consisted of what few nobles had elected to accompany the Crusaders, garbed in full plate armour and riding barded destriers. The lighter horsemen were the surviving Arrabbiati brotherhood, led by Lord Totto himself, recently recovered from the wounds he had received during the battle to save the Duchess Maria. Next stood an antique, multi-layered ribordequin, which had been restored to what was hoped to be full working order. The crew were led by an old soldier, bent with age, who swore he had served the engine in its youth. It was he who had decided that it was best they did not test the barrels by firing, claiming it would be bad luck to do so, for they should only be used in anger. He was fooling no one. It was obvious he feared the old engine of war would likely blow itself to pieces, and would rather it did so after harming the enemy than before even reaching the battlefield. The peasant militia, captained by Father Antonello, who had somehow spent the last 6 hours tirelessly maintaining their spiritual frenzy, stood next in line. These were flanked by the equally large body of militia pikemen. It was among these colourfully attired militia that Biagino stood, having nominally been made their captain. In truth, he only commanded in the way that the lector commanded the army. A militia captain gave all the military orders, at Biagino's request, just as the condottieri general, Urbano d'Alessio, hearkened to the lector's suggestions, then turned them into military orders as he saw fit. Although, now that battle was imminent, General d'Alessio had begun behaving more like a captain than a general, taking personal command of the mounted knights and leaving Lector Bernardo Ugolini in the traditional position for a general, in the rear, at the centre of the line. Biagino had agonised over whether he should insist on rather more active than passive control of the regiment he led, choosing in the end to let circumstances decide. The Lector of Viadazan, Bernardo Ugolini, was accompanied by his bodyguard, whose feathered wings revealed their origins as descendants of mercenary Kislevites, although they were mostly the Tilean grandchildren of men actually born and raised in the icy lands of the far north. Next in line was the 2nd Militia Regiment, the Swordsmen, led by Father Gonsalvo. They were not so large as the Pike Regiment, but they made up for this deficiency in swagger. Then stood the mercenary crossbowmen, calmly refusing to span their bows until the enemy was in sight. Upon the bridge was the army's 2nd artillery piece, a bombard of a long-abandoned design which had been inspected for flaws and cracks by each and every one of the crew nearly every day. They had yet to find any such thing, though the real test would come when they began to fire in anger, again and again, heating the barrel properly for the first time in decades. The army's baggage was placed on the southern side of the river, with several wagons on the bridge itself. Biagino had wondered if this were also part of General D'Alessio's supposed scheme to keep the Crusaders from fleeing too readily. Out on the far left flank stood one company of skirmishing seamen, with the 3rd and last artillery piece, a mortar, placed behind them on the far side of the river. Many a Crusader had prayed that the grenadoes lobbed by this piece would cut great swathes in the enemy lines, tearing their rotten yet animated corpses to pieces. Biagino himself was optimistic, for the undead, deficient as they were in muscle and sinews, must surely be more easily dismembered than living men, and thus much more likely to fall to the mortar's explosive ammunition. The only other company in the crusading army was another body of seamen. Acting the part of scouts, they were not present in the battle line, as they had moved off in an attempt to outflank the Duke's shambling horde. When the vampire Duke's army at last arrived, a general gasp of horror rippled through the ranks and files, not just because of its nature, a shock which had been expected, but also because of its sheer size. It was large, with 4 substantial bodies of foot soldiers moving over the hills, and many even more monstrous horrors besides. Ahead of the army rode a company of hex-wraiths, their every motion unnatural and eerie, as the gleaming bones of their mounts grated beneath fluttering robes which were not fully a part of this world. Behind them, on the far right flank of the undead line, crept a large body of ghouls. Then, next in line, strode a mass of skeleton warriors, momentarily disordered by their descent from the hilly ridge. A huge horde of zombies spilled through the gap in the hills where the road coursed, and beside them came even more skeletons, these being heavily armoured and carrying blades that gleamed in a hellish green. 6 brutish horrors came next, fearful to behold, yet somehow less nightmarish than the vampire Duke himself and his guard of undead knights. Finally, upon the foul horde's far left, atop a hill which now looked like little more than a tiny mound compared with the bulk of the creature upon it, was a terrorgeist. The monster's wings folded and unfolded in a mockery of life, as its head stooped low upon its long and bony neck to espy the foe before it. In even his worst nightmares, Biagino had not imagined the foe as terrible as this. Suddenly, the might of the crusade seemed to diminish. He glanced left and right, and in his mind's eye the soldiers instantly transformed back into farmers and merchants. The divinely inspired agents of Moore's will now appeared to be merely mortal men, fearfully insufficient to the task at hand, and trembling with the realization of the same. They could not possibly win. The foe was too mighty, too monstrous, too many. Then he heard Father Antonello singing. It was a solemn hymn to Moore, yet his defiance was plain to all. It was not the sound of a frightened man trying to fool those around him into believing he was brave, but rather the voice of a man governed wholly by obedience to the god of death, and filled with the confidence of knowing that a god was working through him. More and more voices joined in, until all 3 large regiments were singing. When the Carroccio's bell began pealing in perfect time to the hymn, Biagino felt Moore's presence like he had never done before. They could win. They would win. Moore willed it. The battle. Behind the undead line, the company of scouting seamen climbed a low ridge to see what there was to see. They could not help but halt, for the foe was arrayed so thick and numerous that the crusading army was barely visible beyond them. Still, the scouts had come here to do what could be done to slow the enemy units on this flank, and so, somewhat hesitantly, they cocked their pistols while scrutinising the ground ahead to ascertain the best route forwards. The enemy were not for hesitation, however, for there was not a creature amongst them that could recall what it was to feel such. The hex-wraiths charged at the company of skirmishing seamen on the far left of the line, sending them hurtling away to splash into the waters at the river's edge. On the far side of the field of battle, the monstrously huge terrorgeist flapped in a horribly graceful manner for such a large and ragged beast, and came to land before the mounted men-at-arms. The beast immediately gave vent to a pained and painfully loud squealing, like 100 desperate birds caught in a net. Thinking the sound ugly enough, the men-at-arms had no idea what more the beast could and would yet do with its piercing squawk. The rest of the undead horde shambled onwards, the ones with the longest legs, those mounted on bony horses, and those close to the vampire duke, given impetus by their proximity to him who had raised them, moving quicker and further than the rest. An enormous body of zombies came on in the centre, their stench carrying more than a mile downwind, their gait ungainly, arms swinging wildly. Their black-nailed fingers clutched at the air as they succumbed to the ever-present urge to tear at living flesh. Biagino stood in the front rank of the Viadazan pikemen, happily allowing the two drummers' beating to jolt the tumbling profusion of fearful thoughts from his mind. Only moments before, he had witnessed 5 corpses claw their way out of the ground before the crossbowmen, clearly summoned by the vampire duke to obscure the mercenaries' line of fire. He could not help but worry again that the crusaders had bitten off far, far more than they could chew. The enemy was numerous enough to begin with, and now even more were being raised to serve them. He glanced over at Father Antonello, not for the first time took solace from his reassuring presence. Father Antonello's peasants seemed much more keen for the battle than the militiamen beside them, veritably chomping at the bit to get at the foe. Biagino's escapist reverie was suddenly broken by the dying screams of 2 pikemen succumbing to some spell emanating from the foe. He did not know it, but the undead knights around the vampire duke suffered worse as a consequence of this spell, losing 3 of their number to an uncontrollable spillage of magical energies. But then, only a moment later, they were reanimated by necromantic magic, so that not one crusader had noticed their momentary weakness. General D'Alessio now led his small company of armoured nobility in a brave charge against the terrorgeist, their fear almost entirely washed away by the proximity of the Carroccio and its inspiring collection of Morite icons and relics. Only one knight managed to pierce the tip of his lance into the beast's bony carapace, but it was enough to both visibly weaken the creature and bolster the other knight's courage. With the Crusaders' Morite banner streaming above them, they fought on. As they fought, like mythical knights of old, elsewhere bolts were loosed and iron shots fired. 2 of the ogre-like monsters fell to these missiles, and 5 graveguards joined them in second death. Now, as the hex-wraiths finished the job they had begun and chased the buccaneers off the field of battle entirely, Duke Alessandro led his reformed riders in a charge against the Viadazan noblemen with General D'Alessio. Few among the crusaders could believe that the vampire duke was already engaged in combat, against their army general no less, and with a giant monster by his side. Yet they steeled themselves, while the Arrabati riders moved up to the spot vacated by the noblemen to maintain the cohesion of the crusaders' line. Just then, the men of Viadazan were gifted an awful glimpse of what the enemy was capable of, for the terrorgeist gave vent to another screeching wail, this time so overwhelmingly horrible as to take the life of no less than 5 of the knights attacking it. As their metal-clad corpses slid from their saddles to clatter to the ground, the vampire duke laid about General D'Alessio furiously, raining blow after blow upon him. D'Alessio knew his skill with a blade was insufficient to ward the blows, but his plate armour and the blessing of his holy talisman were up to the task, miraculously preventing each and every blow from wounding him. Obviously outmatched, and most likely to die any moment, the general bravely fought on, accompanied by his one remaining guard, the standard-bearer. Aware that the Duke's death was probably the only thing that could bring the Crusaders victory, and knowing that General de Lesseps could not possibly hope to survive on his own, Father Antonello ordered his regiment of peasants to charge the flank of the undead knights. Not wanting to be outdone by peasants, the Arrabbiati also charged into the Vampire Duke's guard, so that now a huge fight was taking place on the far right of the Crusaders' line. No less than a dozen more grave guards were felled, including some who had already been reanimated by a deadly combination of crossbows, cannon, and mortar. As these worldly weapons were employed, the priests prayed for spiritual aid. In this way, they blessed the peasants with the lesser form of Moor's protection, while Lector Bernardo used his prophetic book to cast the enchantment commonly known as harmonic convergence upon the Arrabbiati. The priests knew both these units would need every bit of help they could get, for although they outnumbered and surrounded the foe, the enemy was both fearless and frightening, better armed and armoured, and unnaturally skilled in the martial arts. Biagino found himself very close to the enemy's brute horrors. When the militia sergeant ordered the pikes levelled, the monstrous foe did not exactly recoil, but it was obvious that somewhere in the tattered remnants of their consciousness they knew that to charge headlong into 6 serried rows of sharp steel tips would be foolish. So it was. They halted, their heads stooped as they leered savagely at the living Viadazans. Somehow, against all the odds, General de Lesseps' magically warded armour continued to save him from each and every one of the almost uncountable blows rained upon him by the Vampire Duke. Despite this, he could not himself harm Duke Alessandro, for the vampire had beguiled him supernaturally, leaving him so befuddled that his own attempts to strike blows were easily parried. Nor did the Arrabbiati's blows prove sufficient, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, neither could the peasants do so much as scratch the enemy. Ignoring the peasants, as if they were of no consequence at all, the foul creatures of the night mortally wounded 6 of the Arrabbiati, their subsequent death cries loud and disturbing. Lord Totto shouted most boldly to the last few that they should stand and see this through, and such was the respect they had for him that they did indeed do so. But not so the peasants. Father Antonello had been dumbfounded by his supposedly blessed warrior's failure to even scratch the foe, and his momentary silence was enough to undo all that he had achieved with his inspiring words. The peasants turned and fled, running right through Biagino's pikemen and Gonsalvo's swordsmen. Neither militia unit broke, perhaps having expected just such behaviour from the peasants, and the peasants burst out of the swordsman's left flank, with the stunned Father Antonello still among them. For the first time in months, even fighting Father Antonello suffered doubt, his faith in Moor so shockingly tested. The green-bladed graveguards now charged the Viadazan swordsmen, their onslaught also catching some of the peasants and forcing them to redouble their efforts to flee. In so doing, the peasants now carried the mercenary crossbowmen with them, both broken companies running pell-mell towards the river, the dangerous depth of the waters entirely forgotten in their desperate urge to escape. Dark magics were summoned by both vampires, so that the undead knights danced macabre, and the graveguards acquired a hellish vigour, but the joint efforts of the Moorite priests and the wizard Lord Totto ensured that none of the enemy dead were reanimated. The Terrorgeist unleashed another horrendous screech, and the last of the Viadazan nobility tumbled from his saddle, his silken banner falling to be trodden into the mud by a taloned and bony claw. A moment later, Lord Totto himself was brutally cut down by the undead knight's champion, and the very last of his shadowy brotherhood fell by his side, leaving General de Lesseps to fight on entirely alone. Once again, despite still being magically befuddled by the Vampire Duke's proximity, his armour and wards proved sufficiently strong, saving the general from each and every blow. Even the vampire duke, his mind cold, cruel, and not quite of this world, began to feel frustration concerning this mere mortal who refused to die. The long line of shambling undead foot soldiers continued its advance, while the graveguards hewed down swordsman after swordsman, with the duke's vampiric captain, once the renowned Empire mercenary Theobald Hackspit, now a monster with barely a trace of human thought remaining, gleefully hacked off the militia champion's head, then joined his guard in their pursuit of the utterly broken Viadazan swordsman. The undead slaughtered every man who ran, and found themselves before the Carroccio, their bestial commander, the tortured demonic spirit now inhabiting the twisted undead corpse of Captain Theobald, grinned with glee. Here was something he would enjoy tearing up as much as any mortal. He could feel the power emanating from it, the spirit of the god who hated the undead more than all others, and his own hatred swelled. He raised his black-clawed hand, gestured, and barked his command. As one, the graveguards hefted their massive blades and prepared to charge. Knowing only too well that to win this battle the vampire duke had to be killed, and that the embattled General D'Alessio could not be expected to fight alone a moment longer against such horrors, the Lector of Viadazan, keenly aware that this would be perhaps the greatest test he faced in his life, yet resolute in his commitment to more, commanded his Kislevite bodyguard to charge with him into the undead knight's flank. This the feathered riders did without hesitation, for since their march from the city they had understood that in a war as desperate as this, their role could not possibly remain merely ceremonial. Glimpsing the lector's charge, Biagino knew that the time for caution was over, and ordered his pikemen to charge into the horrors standing before them. Many of the Viadazans fleeing towards the river witnessed these bold charges, as well as the fact that much of the enemy was still some distance away, and, faced with almost certain death in the cold river waters, decided that desperate flight was perhaps not the best option after all. So it was, the crossbowmen and peasants rallied, reforming their ranks and files with the river immediately to their rear. The crew of the Ribordiquin hefted their ancient war machine anti-clockwise so that it pointed at the graveguards. Then, after a brief moment's hesitation during which one of them screamed at the lector's secretary to get out of the way, they sent a hail of shot to fell 3 of the foe. 2 more were shot down by the Carroccio's handgunners, while the cannon sent a ball into the rickety corpse cart, which tore it to pieces, its punch so severe as to utterly unknit the arcane forces holding the foul and stinking construction together. And still, now clearly miraculous, and unquestionable proof that more was indeed present with the crusaders, General D'Alessio's armour withstood another torrent of blows rained down upon him by the vampire duke. Despite the battering upon his armour and shield, somehow Abano's blade pierced his foe, causing corrupted blood to bubble from the wound, withering the grass wherever its spatters fell. 3 of the vampire duke's grizzled and grim knights were dispatched by the Kislevite riders. Such was the ferocity of the combat that the foul magic sustaining the remaining knights waned to naught, and they now crumpled, as did the Terrorgeist also, collapsing inwards to create a tangled heap of bones and leathery tatters. Duke Alessandro Sforza now fought alone. Biagino was caught up in a no less dangerous combat, praying that the militia pike's hatred of the foe, combined with their practised skill with arms and weight of numbers on their side, would spur them on to victory. It was not to be, however, for despite the ferociousness of their efforts, they barely scratched the foe. The enemy was not so unlucky, and tore into the pikemen so viciously that 10 Viadazans fell. Despite this awful damage, the spirit of Moor sustained the Viadazans, and they stood their ground, clutching tightly at their pikes and leaning upon each other in an attempt to counteract the foe's brute force. Behind them, the surviving graveguards now smashed into the Carroccio, the vampire Theobald screeching with glee as he and his guard hacked at the wagon and crew, ripping both apart. Clambering up the side, tearing a terrified crewman out of the upper platform and hurling him to the ground below, Theobald then yanked the crusaders' army standard from its bracket and threw it down on top of the now dismembered crewman. The vampire duke's right wing, a veritable sea of nightmarish foot soldiers, somewhat removed from the full potency of his commanding will, shambled slowly onwards, gradually closing the gap between themselves and the enemy. The gunner and matrosses manning the cannon on the bridge might have become worried about the massed regiment's proximity, had they not been at that moment on the receiving end of a charge by the hellish horse wraiths. Needless to say, the gun crew stood no chance, and all perished quickly. The wraiths then burst out from the other side of the bridge, galloping over the river waters as if on solid ground, their ghostly, unnatural hooves barely splashing as they moved. Clambering over the splintered wreckage of the Carroccio, the vampire Captain Theobald led his ancient warriors in a charge against the recently rallied peasants. Considering how the peasants had so far behaved, and how bloodily effective the graveguards had been despite being greatly diminished by missile fire, and with the mobile shrine of Moor, which had until now been the focus of any confidence the peasants possessed, having been completely desecrated, it was obvious that they could not possibly hope to stand. Yet, for the briefest moment, it appeared they had a chance, for they certainly had numbers on their side, and somehow they found the courage to attempt the fight, at least. Biagino and the pikemen once again suffered horrendous casualties, beaten by bone clubs bigger than themselves, and yet still they too stood their ground. Biagino himself found he could do little more than pray, while the pike shafts packed close around him protected him from harm. On the far right of the Crusaders' line, the desperate fight against the vampire duke continued, with General D'Alessio's beaten and bent armour once again preventing the duke's blade from penetrating his flesh. The general himself was now barely able to wield his own blade, weakened by his long efforts, and finally succumbing to fearfulness. The fight had been impossibly long, the foe so nightmarish that it was all he could do just to stay mounted as the blows rang repeatedly upon his steel armour. Lector Bernardo could see what a state he was in, and so read from his prophetic book to cast the spell Harmonic Convergence on the general. The lector also tried to inflict Moor's Stare on the vampire duke, but Alessandro's skill with magic easily brushed the prayer aside. And yet it proved just enough, howsoever briefly, to distract the vampire. And in that moment, quite suddenly, and to his own surprise, General D'Alessio snapped out of the magical beguilement that had until now ensnared his mind. The fight between them blazed anew, as both thrust and parried, hacked and twisted, and still the general's armour could not be pierced. Although he could not pierce the other, Duke Alessandro's grip on undeath was now becoming ever more weak. He was surrounded by foes, outnumbered, alone. Finally, to the utter astonishment of those fighting him, he slumped suddenly forwards in his saddle, his head lolling to bash against his mount's skull. Then, with an angrily anguished moan, he tumbled to the ground, as the beast carrying him collapsed into nothing more than a pile of bones. General D'Alessio let his aching sword arm drop to his side, his tears hidden by his much-dented helm. The Kislevites thrust their long spears, one after the other, again and again, into the vampire duke's now motionless corpse. Duke Alessandro Sforza was dead. Not merely unliving, but truly and completely dead. In that moment, the necromantic force holding the entire undead army in this realm was greatly weakened. Like a wave washing across a beach, the diminishment in its power spread across the field of battle. A brace of the crypt horrors fighting Biagino and the militia pikemen collapsed, as did half a dozen zombies, many more skeletons, and 4 of the graveguards. All 5 hex wraiths simply vanished, as nothing more than smoke carried away by a breeze. No one cheered. The lector, his guards, and General D'Alessio were simply too exhausted, while all the rest remained embroiled in mortal combat, and could not yet know what had happened. But the vampire Theobald knew full well. He had felt his sire's death in the very core of his being. Grimacing, as if his face was not ugly enough already, he refused to allow the anguished cry building inside him to be released. Instead, he turned and loped away, not a frantic, scrambling flight, but rather purposeful and controlled. For as he ran, he directed all the magical power he could muster to invigorate the army, ordering it to fall back, retreat, escape, drinking every drop of the etheric winds he could to hold his warriors in this world. He intended to take all he could with him, away from the place of his master's death. Where he was going, what he intended to do, only he knew. Over where the foul remains of the vampire duke lay, corrupting the soil beneath, the Lector and General D'Alessio discussed their next actions. After all that had happened so far, they no longer feared what was around them. Even the massive, though now crumbling, force of zombies and ghouls seemed of little consequence compared to what they had already faced and beaten. Before long, their orders were given, and the surviving crusaders began falling back southwards over the bridge. To some, pushing on against the defeated foe might seem the most desirable course, but the Lector and General D'Alessio knew their men were utterly exhausted, and that a vampire still commanded what remained a sizable enemy force. The enemy was not tired. It suffered no such mortal complaints. The enemy was not afraid, for no trace of emotion was left to them. The important work had been done. The vampire duke was dead, his army in retreat. Now there was surely time to regroup, recuperate, recruit, and then return to complete what they had so effectively begun.